George Smith. Patton Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, to a family steeped in military tradition. The Patton name was synonymous with battle, leadership, and legacy. His father, George Smith Patton Sr., had achieved success not only in business, but also through a stern belief in personal discipline. The Patton family's military history was rich, dating back to the Revolutionary War, with ancestors who fought in the Civil War and the War of 1812. For young George, growing up in such a household meant one thing: excellence was non-negotiable. Patton Sr. was a strict and demanding father, determined that his children would uphold the family name and be successful in every endeavor. From the moment George could walk, his father ingrained in him the principles of leadership, accountability, and toughness. His father was not merely a parent, but also a mentor who believed in molding George into a man who could take charge in any situation. While George Sr. was not afraid to show affection, he held high expectations, often demanding nothing less than perfect performance in academics and physical pursuits alike. Growing up, young George had a fierce drive to prove himself. In his early years, he was known to be a studious and competitive child, always striving to meet or surpass the expectations of his father. His home was filled with books on history, military strategy, and accounts of great warriors, each page turning George's mind toward the idea of combat and leadership. Every moment in his life seemed calculated to push him closer to fulfilling his destiny. A destiny not merely to serve, but to lead. By the time George was a teenager, he had already internalized the pressures of greatness. The relationship with his father, while steeped in discipline, was not without its emotional toll. It's clear that George felt both the weight of his father's expectations and a fierce desire to live up to the Patton name. Despite the strict upbringing, there was always an underlying sense of admiration and love for a father who had imparted such powerful life lessons. But beneath the surface of admiration, there was also a deep-rooted fear of failure, the sense that no matter how hard he tried, he could never truly be enough without meeting the impossible standards of his family. His father, too, was an indelible figure in shaping George's sense of duty and military potential. George Sr. was no stranger to the harsh realities of life. Having fought in the Spanish-American War, his own experience had fortified him against setbacks, teaching him that failure was unacceptable. This shared sense of discipline and resolve transferred from father to son, laying the groundwork for George's later obsession with perfection. For George Patton, there was no room for error. His father's voice loomed large in every decision, every action. West Point, a storm of arrogance and ambition. In 1903, George Patton set his sights on entering the prestigious U.S. Military Academy at West Point, a goal that seemed to be the natural progression of his life. He arrived with a reputation of both brilliance and stubbornness, traits that would follow him throughout his life. But West Point, with its strict traditions and formidable academic demands, was not the welcoming place George had imagined. He soon discovered that West Point would not coddle him. In fact, it might even challenge the very core of his identity. From the outset, Patton's genius was evident. His abilities in physical training, military strategy, and leadership were exceptional, but it was his personality that often led to tension. Patton's arrogance was both a strength and a flaw. He never hesitated to challenge the authority of those around him, whether it was instructors or fellow cadets. His deep sense of superiority made him a polarizing figure. Some admired him for his brilliance, while others saw him as brash, self-absorbed, and even insufferable. His combative nature was already a trait he carried proudly, a characteristic that would define his interactions with peers and subordinates alike. But despite the friction, Patton's determination never wavered. He was not interested in fitting in. He was focused on one thing: becoming the best. It wasn't just about academics or winning approval from his peers. It was about proving that he could dominate the system. His obsession with victory, excellence, and personal achievement only deepened at West Point. While he didn't graduate at the top of his class, his place at number 46 out of 103 cadets in the class of 1909 reflected his ability to meet the high expectations he set for himself, even if his classmates sometimes thought him arrogant or aloof. Patton was driven by something far beyond academic performance. It was the need to command, to lead, and to win. It was also here at West Point that Patton's obsession with warfare took root. He began to immerse himself in military history, studying not just tactics and techniques, but the very philosophy of war itself. Napoleon's conquests, Alexander's leadership, and Hannibal's daring strategies were constant points of reference. Patton believed that a true leader understood the past so well that they could bend its lessons to shape the future. To him, war was more than a profession. It was an art. And he, like the great generals he admired, would be its master. Patton's friction with authority, however, did not go unnoticed. His contentious relationship with his classmates and superiors was often at odds with the academy's rigorous structure. His inability to fully conform to the military's expectations made him an outsider in many ways. However, his commanders saw something extraordinary in him. They saw his potential not just as a soldier, but as a strategist and a leader who could reshape the future of the US military. Despite his flaws, they recognized that Patton had the raw talent to become one of the greatest military minds of his generation. A passion for warfare, influences, and early interests. Patton's interest in war was not born out of simple curiosity, it was a calling. His fascination with battle and the great warriors of history ran deep. From his earliest days at West Point, Patton began to study warfare with an intensity that bordered on obsession. For him, understanding the strategies of military greats was not merely academic, it was his life's purpose. He was not just learning how wars were won, he was preparing to wage his own. Every day was spent in pursuit of mastery, perfecting the art of war, and preparing for the inevitable battles of the future. In particular, Patton's early interests gravitated toward the cavalry. This wasn't a random choice. Patton believed that the cavalry was the key to victory. Their speed, mobility, and shock power made them a decisive force on the battlefield. His admiration for cavalrymen grew as he studied their tactics and legendary leaders, and he saw himself as their natural successor. He envisioned a world where cavalry was not just a support unit, but the spearhead of modern warfare. Patton studied cavalry warfare meticulously, memorizing every detail of how these soldiers maneuvered in battle, how they fought, and how they led. This fascination wasn't merely intellectual, it was a commitment to making cavalry his future. Patton's studies were not limited to practical warfare alone. He became deeply influenced by the philosophical aspects of combat. He believed in the concept of fighting for glory, that a soldier's true worth was not determined by the battles they won, but by their courage and willingness to push beyond the limits of conventional warfare. Patton read books on ancient battles, military tactics, and even the lives of the great commanders who had shaped history. His mind was set on a single objective: to become a general whose name would be etched into the annals of history. And while his peers focused on grades or status, Patton focused on one thing: combat. He was aware of the weight of military history on his shoulders. Every book he read, every lecture he attended, was another building block in his journey toward greatness. His mind was sharpened by the ideas of Clausewitz, Napoleon, and other strategists who had shaped the military world. They weren't just heroes to him, they were teachers, mentors across time. Patton saw himself as part of an unbroken line of military leaders destined to lead America to greatness. Mentors and early influences. One of the most important figures in Patton's life during his early years at West Point was General John J. Pershing. Pershing was not only a towering figure in the US Army, but also a man of great influence over the young cadet. While Patton was still coming to terms with his own leadership potential, Pershing saw in him a kindred spirit. a man driven by the same fierce ambition, the same desire to lead. Under Pershing's mentorship, Patton's ideas began to take shape. Pershing recognized Patton's unique gifts and offered him opportunities to prove his worth, particularly in the newly forming tank corps. But even in the midst of mentorship, Patton's personality often clashed with that of his superiors. He was a man who could never entirely conform to military bureaucracy. His outspokenness, his impatience with convention, and his desire for immediate action often put him at odds with military leaders who favored a more measured approach. While Pershing saw potential, Patton's explosive personality made it difficult for some of his colleagues to fully embrace his style. Nevertheless, Patton thrived under pressure and was never one to back down from a challenge. Patton's role in World War I, a revolutionary approach to warfare. In the summer of 1917, George S. Patton was thrust into a war unlike anything he had studied at West Point. The world was in turmoil, with Europe entrenched in one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. But for Patton, it was also the beginning of his own journey into the brutal reality of combat, a journey that would shape him into the legendary general he would become. Patton was assigned to the U.S. Tank Corps, a newly formed unit that was unlike anything the military had seen before. Tanks were a revolutionary concept, an attempt to break the gridlocked trench warfare that had characterized the First World War. The tank was a machine built to change the rules of war, big, heavy, armored, and capable of withstanding enemy fire. To many, it seemed like a wild idea. But to Patton, it was the future of warfare. The Tank Corps was still in its infancy, and Patton saw this as a golden opportunity to influence its development. He was passionate about tanks. His interest wasn't just in the machine itself, but in how it could be used to outmaneuver the enemy and break through lines that had once seemed impenetrable. This was a man who had studied military history intensely. He admired the great leaders, Napoleon, Alexander the Great, and Hannibal, and understood that warfare was evolving. To Patton, the tank was the next step in that evolution, and he was determined to be at the forefront of this change. Patton didn't just use tanks in battle, he lived and breathed them. He obsessed over the details of their design, studied tank tactics with unyielding intensity, and demanded that the military see their potential. His leadership in this new and unfamiliar field would prove pivotal. While many senior officers were skeptical about the effectiveness of tanks, Patton saw their future. His work with the Tank Corps would eventually change the way armies fought, and his own future as well. In a time when the military was still steeped in traditional tactics, Patton was on the cutting edge of military innovation. In his early days with the Tank Corps, Patton's passion and commitment to the cause were evident. He worked tirelessly, often pushing his men to their limits, convinced that their success would shape the outcome of the war. He wasn't just a commander, he was a visionary. He saw tank warfare as the key to breaking the stalemate of trench warfare. He advocated for more tanks, better training, and faster implementation. He faced resistance, but his conviction only grew stronger. The first major test came during the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in September 1918. This was Patton's chance to prove that tanks could make a real difference. The Americans, along with their allies, launched an offensive to drive the Germans out of the region. Patton's tanks were put to the test, and despite the challenges, they performed better than many expected. They were able to break through enemy lines, creating a path for infantry and helping turn the tide in the battle. The victory was not just a military success, it was a proof of concept for Patton's ideas. Combat experience and leadership, a harsh awakening. The transition from theoretical strategy to the brutal reality of war was not an easy one for Patton. The battlefields of World War I were unforgiving, and every decision had consequences. The horrors of combat, death, destruction, and the constant threat of injury or worse were unlike anything Patton had experienced in his studies or his earlier military training. And yet, in the face of these horrors, Patton thrived. Patton's leadership style was aggressive, unconventional, and at times reckless. He didn't just sit behind the lines and issue orders, he led from the front. This was a man who believed that to lead, one had to be in the thick of the action, experiencing the same dangers as those under his command. It wasn't enough for Patton to be a distant figurehead. He wanted to be the one charging into battle, leading his men with fire in his belly. At Saint-Mihiel, Patton's tanks played a significant role, but his success wasn't just about tanks. It was about how he adapted to the situation. When his tanks encountered unexpected obstacles, Patton didn't hesitate. He rethought his strategy, adjusted his tactics on the fly, and kept pushing forward. His leadership was marked by flexibility, decisiveness, and a dogged determination to succeed. For Patton, failure was never an option. His relentless nature was evident even in moments of adversity. When things went wrong, he didn't make excuses, he found solutions. But war is chaotic, and not every mission was successful. There were moments when Patton's aggressive tactics put him and his men at risk. At times, his eagerness to prove the worth of his tanks led to costly mistakes. Tanks got stuck in mud, broke down, or were rendered useless by enemy fire. Patton's men began to question their commander's insistence on pushing forward at all costs. Some even wondered if his obsession with tank warfare might cost them dearly. But Patton never wavered. His ability to adapt and keep moving forward became one of his defining characteristics. For him, the mission was always more important than the individual. One of the most pivotal moments came when Patton was faced with the logistical nightmare of his tanks getting bogged down in deep mud. The plan had been to push the tanks deep into enemy territory, but the terrain didn't cooperate. The tanks were stuck. The operation seemed doomed, but rather than give up, Patton worked tirelessly, finding ways to get the tanks moving again. His leadership in this moment showed the depth of his commitment, not just to the mission, but to his men. He didn't abandon them. He was in the trenches with them, figuring out a way forward. This willingness to face adversity head-on earned Patton the loyalty and respect of his soldiers. Injury and recovery, the price of war. It was during one of these grueling battles that Patton would experience the personal price of war. In October 1918, Patton was shot in the leg during a reconnaissance mission. It wasn't a fatal wound, but it was severe enough to require an extended recovery period. For many soldiers, an injury like this would have been the end of their combat career. But Patton was not like other men. Patton's injury was a turning point. While he lay in a hospital in England, recovering from his wounds, he faced a long and painful journey. His leg had been shattered, and he was unable to walk for some time. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was the mental toll of being sidelined that hurt Patton the most. War had been his calling, his reason for living. To be taken out of the fight was almost as painful as the injury itself. Despite the severity of the injury, Patton was determined to return to the front. The road to recovery was grueling, but Patton attacked it with the same relentless determination he had shown on the battlefield. He underwent extensive physical therapy, pushing himself to regain his strength. It wasn't easy. Every day was a struggle, but Patton's focus never wavered. His desire to return to battle was overpowering. The recovery process didn't just bring Patton back physically, it also changed his perspective on war. He had seen the horrors firsthand, felt the pain, and understood the cost of leadership. While his body healed, his mind was constantly at work. Patton began to reassess the nature of warfare, and he solidified his belief in strict discipline, aggressive tactics, and the importance of offensive strategies. War, in his eyes, was a necessary evil, but it was also a battlefield for proving one's will to lead and survive. His time in recovery reinforced these beliefs and deepened his commitment to military excellence. Impact of World War I on Patton's philosophy. A soldier transformed. By the time the war ended, Patton had undergone a profound transformation. He was no longer just a soldier. He had become a leader forged in the crucible of battle. The horrors of World War I, its brutality, its senseless death, its soul-crushing reality, had solidified many of the beliefs Patton would carry with him for the rest of his life. The war had solidified his belief in the importance of aggressive, offensive tactics. Patton had learned early on that hesitation on the battlefield could lead to disaster. The key to victory, in his mind, was to take the fight to the enemy, never to wait for them to make the first move. He also came to believe that discipline was paramount. The soldiers who followed orders and executed commands without question were the ones who would succeed in the chaos of battle. War, Patton believed, was not a place for doubt, hesitation, or second-guessing. It was a place for strength, action, and decisiveness. Patton's exposure to the realities of war had also shaped his views on leadership. He came to see leadership not as a position of authority, but as a constant test of resolve. Leaders had to be able to withstand the same hardships as their men. They had to lead by example, showing the way even when the path ahead seemed impossible. And perhaps most importantly, they had to have the mental and physical toughness to endure the horrors of war. Patton's injury had only solidified these beliefs. To him, the ability to withstand pain was not just a personal trait. It was a military necessity. The leaders who could endure hardship would be the ones who led their men to victory. Comrades and fellow soldiers, the men who fought alongside him. The soldiers who fought alongside Patton saw firsthand what made him different. While other officers were content to stay behind the lines, Patton led from the front. His men followed him not just because he was their superior, but because they saw his unyielding commitment to the mission. They knew that Patton wouldn't ask them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. He wasn't just a commander, he was one of them, willing to share in the hardships of combat. But Patton's relationship with his men was not without its complexities. His perfectionism and high expectations sometimes created friction. He demanded nothing less than excellence from those under his command, and those who fell short of his standards often faced his sharp reprimands. His temper was legendary, and it wasn't uncommon for Patton to become angry at the slightest failure. But despite his harshness, his men respected him. They saw his drive, his unrelenting pursuit of victory, and they followed him because they believed in him. The bond between Patton and his soldiers was forged in fire. The men who served under him knew that Patton's leadership was not about glory or accolades. It was about survival. It was about winning. And it was about ensuring that every soldier under his command would make it out alive. The soldiers who fought with him understood this, and it was this shared understanding that made Patton one of the most respected and feared leaders of his time. Patton's post-World War I career, shaping the future of tank warfare. When World War I ended, George S. Patton returned to the U.S. Army with one vision firmly etched in his mind. The future of combat was mechanized. The conflict had exposed the limits of traditional warfare. The blood-soaked trenches and static lines had become synonymous with death, destruction, and stalemates. Tanks, Patton believed, could change that. They could shatter the deadlock, break through lines, and enable armies to move faster and more decisively than ever before. The war had taught Patton that speed and maneuverability were crucial in achieving victory, and tanks represented the future of that vision. At the war's conclusion, Patton was a man transformed. Having seen the value of tanks in breaking through the enemy's defensive lines during the final stages of the conflict, he believed that tank warfare was the key to revolutionizing how wars would be fought in the 20th century. But while the US Army had seen the potential of mechanized warfare, it was still reluctant to invest deeply in it. Patton, however, was relentless. He was obsessed with tanks, not just as a tool of warfare, but as a new era in military strategy. Patton's first major task upon returning to the US Army was to put his vision into practice. He took up a position with the newly established US Tank Corps and immediately set to work on organizing tank training exercises. Patton wasn't content to simply oversee operations. He was determined to lead by example. He immersed himself in tank warfare. not just studying the tactics, but also understanding the mechanics of the machines themselves. Tanks were a revolutionary tool, and Patton saw himself as one of their greatest advocates. Under his leadership, the Tank Corps became a proving ground for Patton's bold ideas. The American military establishment at the time was not entirely convinced that tanks could replace traditional methods of warfare, but Patton's belief in their potential was unshakable. He worked tirelessly, organizing training programs, developing tank tactics, and lobbying for increased funding for the development of the tanks themselves. But while his efforts were crucial to the development of mechanized warfare, they also put him at odds with the traditionalists in the military, those who still believed that cavalry and infantry were the primary forces to be reckoned with. In 1919, Patton played a significant role in establishing the first tank schools in the U.S. Army, pushing for tank training to be standardized and advanced. His work in this area helped to lay the groundwork for the rapid mechanization of the U.S. military, which would prove critical in the lead-up to World War II. But Patton's focus on tanks did not go unnoticed by his superiors, many of whom had their own reservations about his unorthodox approach. Despite the challenges he faced, Patton's role in the early development of the Tank Corps made him one of the most forward-thinking military leaders of his time. He was proving that tanks, when used correctly, could be a game-changer in a warfare. The groundwork he laid during these years would help shape the direction of American military strategy in the years to come. Friction with superiors, a conflict of vision and personality. While Patton's career was moving forward in some areas, his unrelenting focus on tanks was causing friction with his superiors. Patton was a man of intense passion and deep conviction. He didn't just think tanks could change warfare. He was convinced that they would change the face of battle forever. And he wasn't willing to compromise on this belief. One of Patton's most significant clashes during this time occurred with General Somervell, the commanding officer in charge of military logistics. Somervell, like many in the U.S. Army, was a traditionalist. He believed in the effectiveness of established methods: infantry-based combat, artillery, and cavalry. Patton, on the other hand, was advocating for a revolutionary shift, pushing for tanks to be integrated as a core element of the military's strategic plans. Somervell's resistance to Patton's vision wasn't personal. It was a clash of military philosophies. Patton's unyielding determination to push tank warfare forward put him at odds with Somervell, who believed that tanks were unproven and that the Army should stick with traditional strategies. The tension between the two was palpable, and it wasn't the only instance of conflict during these years. Patton's personality also made him a difficult figure for some of his superiors to work with. His uncompromising nature and willingness to challenge authority rubbed many the wrong way. While Patton's ideas were groundbreaking, his confrontational manner often made him an outsider within the military hierarchy. He wasn't one to defer to higher-ups, especially when he believed their views were misguided. This didn't sit well with many of his superiors, and as a result, Patton's promotions were slow, and his career advancement was often hindered. Patton's insistence on pushing tank technology, even in the face of significant opposition, led to some tension within his unit as well. He could be hard on those who didn't meet his expectations. He demanded excellence and had little patience for those who fell short. His temper was often the cause of friction among his men, but his leadership was also deeply admired. Despite the constant strain of his personality and approach, Patton was able to attract a group of loyal followers, soldiers who believed in his vision and were willing to push forward, even when the military establishment seemed reluctant to embrace the future. But it wasn't just Somervell who disagreed with Patton. The wider military establishment was slow to warm to Patton's vision of mechanized warfare. Patton's intense advocacy for tanks, often accompanied by fiery speeches and relentless lobbying, earned him both praise and scorn. While some saw him as a visionary, others viewed him as an agitator who was disrupting the status quo. His career during this period was marked by a constant battle for recognition and acceptance of his ideas. Creation of the U.S. Tank Corps, the birth of a new era. Despite the resistance he faced, Patton's work eventually led to the creation of the U.S. Tank Corps as an independent unit within the U.S. Army. The establishment of this unit in 1920 was a significant milestone for Patton and for the U.S. military as a whole. It represented a shift in thinking, albeit a slow one, and was a testament to Patton's influence on military strategy. The creation of the Tank Corps was a sign that despite the skepticism and opposition he faced, Patton was starting to reshape how the military viewed tanks and their role in modern warfare. However, even as the Tank Corps came into being, Patton's battle was far from over. The Corps was still seen by many as an experimental unit, and there was no guarantee that it would survive in a military that was deeply entrenched in its old ways. Tanks were still a relatively new technology, and their role in warfare had not yet been fully realized. But Patton believed that tanks would be the future of combat, and he was willing to fight tooth and nail to ensure that this future came to fruition. In the years that followed, Patton's Tank Corps was essential in pushing forward the idea of mechanized warfare. While the rest of the military was still holding on to older tactics, Patton's work laid the groundwork for tank strategy that would prove decisive in future conflicts. He worked tirelessly on tank training programs, refined tank tactics, and pushed for the development of more advanced tank models. His dedication during this time would prove invaluable when World War II broke out, as the U.S. Army was able to draw on the principles Patton had developed years earlier. Relationship with General Somervell, a clash of ideals. Patton's relationship with General Somervell was a microcosm of the larger battles he was fighting within the military. Somervell was a figurehead of the old guard, a man who valued traditional methods of warfare. Patton, with his insistence on innovation and his belief in the potential of mechanized combat, was a challenge to this way of thinking. Despite their ideological differences, there were moments when Patton and Somervell's relationship had a practical element. Somervell, being in charge of military logistics, held significant sway over the allocation of resources. At times, Patton had to rely on Somervell's support to get the tanks and equipment he needed. But even in these moments, their relationship was tense. Patton's temper and blunt manner meant that compromise was not always easy. One of the most significant issues between Patton and Somervell was Patton's relentless push for more funding for the Tank Corps. Patton saw the future of warfare in tanks, but Somervell's more conservative outlook meant he often resisted Patton's calls for resources. This strained their relationship even further and contributed to Patton's feeling of isolation within the Army. Despite their differences, Patton's obsession with tanks and his belief in their potential ultimately helped him secure a place for tanks within the military's strategic thinking. His clashes with Somervell highlighted the generational divide between the old guard and the new wave of military thinking. Patton's aggressive push for innovation and change was at odds with Somervell's traditionalism, but in the end, it was Patton's vision that prevailed. Patton's increasing isolation, the price of his vision. Throughout this period, Patton's increasing isolation within the Army was a constant theme. His passionate commitment to tanks, while revolutionary, made him a polarizing figure. He was a man ahead of his time, and this often left him fighting not just for recognition, but for the very future of the U.S. military. His unwillingness to temper his convictions and his confrontational approach made him a figure that many senior officers found difficult to work with. Patton's isolation was not just a product of his personality. It was a reflection of the larger military culture. The U.S. Army was steeped in tradition, and Patton's push for mechanized warfare clashed with the conservative views of many officers. His relentless pursuit of tanks, coupled with his volatile temper and bold personality, made him an outsider within the military hierarchy. But even as Patton faced this isolation, he refused to compromise. He knew that the future of warfare depended on the ideas he was advocating for, and he was willing to pay the price for pushing them forward. While Patton's isolation within the military was a personal challenge, it also became a source of strength. His unwillingness to bend to authority allowed him to develop a level of independence that would serve him well in future conflicts. The years of struggle, frustration, and isolation only solidified his resolve, and as World War II loomed on the horizon, Patton was ready to lead the charge for the future of tank warfare. Sicily invasion. Operation Husky. The first test of leadership. In July 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. This was Patton's first major test in World War II, a test of his leadership, his boldness, and his ability to command under the pressure of battle. The success of this operation would make or break his career. For Patton, this was not just another military campaign. It was an opportunity to prove that his unconventional ideas about warfare were not just theory, but the future of combat. Patton was given command of the U.S. 7th Army, tasked with landing on the southern shore of Sicily. It was a mission fraught with complications from the start. The weather delayed the landing, rough seas caused chaos for the troops, and the enemy had fortified the island in anticipation. But for Patton, the delays were an annoyance. His goal was always to move forward, regardless of the circumstances. He was a man who believed in relentless speed. He wanted to break through the enemy lines as quickly as possible and keep advancing, without giving them time to regroup. The challenge of securing Sicily required bold, decisive action. Patton's tactical brilliance was on full display during the operation. He understood that the key to victory in Sicily was speed. Get in, break the enemy's lines, and then push further. While other commanders hesitated, Patton drove his forces forward, making swift decisions on the move. His leadership was inspiring. He managed to motivate his men to continue charging, even when they were exhausted. Patton was not someone who would sit behind a desk, issuing orders from a distance. He was right there on the front lines with his soldiers. But Patton's leadership style wasn't just about inspiring confidence in his men. It was also about taking risks. One of the first major challenges came when Patton faced stiff resistance at the city of Palermo. While other commanders took a more cautious approach, Patton, true to his aggressive style, ordered a rapid push through difficult terrain, determined to break the resistance. The decision worked, but it also came at a high cost. The casualties were heavy, but Patton's belief that speed was key to victory meant that he would not allow the pace of the operation to slow down. Patton's forcefulness was as much about his personality as it was about his military strategy. His blunt, no-nonsense style set him apart from other generals. He had no patience for failure, no time for hesitation. His men admired him for his decisiveness, but they also feared him. Patton was known for being demanding. His temper was notorious, and failure was never tolerated. Even as the operation succeeded, Patton's men were aware of the price of their victory, success, but at a heavy toll. The Allies secured Sicily in under a month, and while the victory was celebrated, the consequences of Patton's leadership style became evident. His insistence on pushing forward quickly led to mistakes, and his temper remained a double-edged sword. But even so, the success of the campaign was largely attributed to Patton's leadership, his ability to command in the heat of battle, and his unwavering belief that the speed of attack was paramount. He had proven himself in his first major command, but the controversy surrounding his style was just beginning. The slapping incident, a moment of controversy. While Patton's military brilliance in Sicily was undeniable, it would also be the catalyst for one of the most controversial incidents of his career, the infamous slapping incident. The event that threatened to derail his military career occurred in August 1943, when Patton, enraged by what he saw as cowardice, physically assaulted two soldiers suffering from what was later known as battle fatigue, or shell shock. The incident occurred in a field hospital where Patton encountered two soldiers who were unfit for combat due to psychological wounds. To Patton, the sight of men who had, in his view, failed to live up to the demands of battle was unforgivable. He slapped one soldier, berating him for being unworthy of wearing the uniform, then repeated the same treatment for a second soldier, accusing him of cowardice. Patton's fury over what he perceived as a weakness was compounded by the pressures of command. In his mind, the soldiers' suffering was a betrayal of their duty. For him, war was about toughness, both physical and mental, and any failure to meet those standards was unforgivable. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. News of the incident spread rapidly, and it was met with outrage both in the US Army and among the American public. Many saw Patton's actions as a gross violation of military ethics and as a failure of leadership. To strike men in the midst of their suffering, to publicly humiliate them, was seen as a personal failure on Patton's part. The incident threatened to overshadow the successes Patton had achieved in Sicily, casting doubt on his leadership. Patton, who had always been a figure of authority and discipline, was forced to apologize publicly, but the damage had been done. His actions, no matter how well-intentioned, revealed the darker side of his personality, his impulsiveness, his inability to temper his emotions in the face of pressure, and his overwhelming need to control every aspect of his command. The slapping incident became a symbol of Patton's volatile nature and would follow him throughout his career, leaving a permanent stain on his reputation. Despite the apology, Patton's reputation took a major hit. The US military, already weary of his outspoken nature, questioned whether he could continue leading with such a reputation. For many, the incident confirmed their doubts about his suitability for higher command. The very qualities that had made him an exceptional battlefield leader, his unrelenting drive and his refusal to compromise, had now brought him to the brink of professional ruin. Patton's command of the Third Army, the Battle of the Bulge. Despite the controversy surrounding him, Patton's military career was far from over. In 1944, he was given command of the Third Army, which was tasked with driving through France and eventually liberating Germany. For Patton, this was his moment to shine. With the D-Day invasion having successfully established a foothold in Europe, the pressure was on to drive deep into German territory. Patton's aggressive, fast-moving tactics were ideal for this kind of warfare, and his reputation as a quick and decisive leader only grew stronger as the war progressed. Patton's leadership of the Third Army was marked by speed. He understood that momentum was everything. His forces moved rapidly through France, liberating towns and cities as they went. The key to Patton's success was his focus on offensive warfare. He wanted to push his soldiers forward, always seeking to maintain the initiative. He had little patience for the defensive-minded strategies that some of his fellow generals preferred. For Patton, there was no room for hesitation. Every move was a chance to strike at the enemy. But Patton's greatest test came in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes forest, aiming to divide the Allied forces and recapture key territory. The situation was desperate. The Allies were caught off guard, and it seemed as though the Germans might succeed in their goal. Patton, however, was undeterred. With the Third Army spread out across France, Patton wasted no time reorganizing his forces and launching a counteroffensive. What followed was a remarkable feat of military brilliance. Patton's forces moved swiftly to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, which had been surrounded by German troops. His men fought fiercely, breaking through the German lines and turning the tide of the battle. In just a few days, Patton's Third Army had decisively struck back, restoring the balance of power on the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge became a defining moment of Patton's leadership. His ability to rally his troops, make quick decisions, and execute a fast-paced counteroffensive showcased the core of his military philosophy: speed, aggression, and mobility. But it also highlighted the cost of Patton's leadership style. His soldiers were pushed hard, often to their physical and emotional limits, and the casualties were heavy. For Patton, however, there was no room for hesitation. The battle had to be won, and any sacrifice was justified in the pursuit of that victory. Tactics and leadership style, aggression and controversy. Patton's leadership style was as unconventional as it was effective. he was driven by a single, unwavering belief that speed and aggression were the keys to victory. He had little patience for defensive strategies, preferring instead to take the fight directly to the enemy. His tactics were aggressive, sometimes bordering on reckless, and his troops were often pushed beyond what seemed reasonable. Patton's army moved with a relentless pace, keeping the enemy constantly on the back foot. But this aggressive style came with its own set of problems. While it often led to spectacular successes, it also brought high casualties. Patton's soldiers admired his courage and vision, but they also feared the immense pressure he placed on them. His temper was legendary. He could be charming, charismatic, and motivating one moment, and then lose control and explode with rage the next. His frustration with soldiers who didn't meet his expectations, whether due to fear or failure, was known to result in harsh words, even violence. Patton's relationship with his fellow commanders, like General Bradley and Eisenhower, was a mixture of admiration and tension. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, recognized Patton's brilliance but struggled to rein him in. While Eisenhower respected Patton's tactical genius, he was often wary of his volatile nature. Bradley, another key figure in the Allied command, admired Patton's effectiveness, but was more cautious in his approach to warfare. Both men saw Patton as an asset, but one that had to be carefully managed. Patton's men, on the other hand, were divided. For some, Patton was an inspiration. His confidence, energy, and bravery in the face of danger gave them the courage to fight harder. For others, he was a tyrant, a man whose expectations were impossible to meet, whose temper could turn the tide of the battle against them. But despite the fear and respect he commanded, there was no denying Patton's impact on the battlefield. His ability to turn the tide in moments of crisis, to lead from the front, and to make quick, decisive choices under extreme pressure was a rare gift. Patton's role in post-war Europe, a soldier with no war. When World War II ended, General George S. Patton found himself in a strange and unexpected position. The very qualities that had made him a hero, his bold leadership, his aggressive tactics, and his obsession with victory, now made him an increasingly isolated figure. The war had been won, but Patton was about to enter a battle he hadn't fully prepared for: the post-war world. Patton's role in post-war Europe was complicated. For most of the war, he had been the fierce, unstoppable force leading his troops through the heart of Nazi territory. He had liberated France, smashed through Germany's defenses, and earned a reputation as one of the greatest military minds of the 20th century. But the war's end left him in a different kind of battle, one that didn't involve tanks or troops, but politics and diplomacy. Patton had always been a man who spoke his mind. His blunt nature and his impatience with bureaucracy were part of what made him an effective battlefield leader, but those same qualities would undermine him in the delicate political landscape of post-war Europe. Patton believed that the Soviet Union was the next major threat to world peace, and he was vocal in his criticism of US foreign policy towards the USSR. He argued that the Allies had made a dangerous mistake by not confronting the Soviets sooner during the war. He saw the Soviet Union as a brutal dictatorship that would, in time, turn against the West. In the months following the war, Patton's outspoken views on the Soviets became more pronounced. He urged for a direct confrontation with Stalin's forces, believing that it was only a matter of time before the USSR turned its aggression toward Europe. His views were in stark contrast to the diplomatic approaches taken by his superiors, particularly General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who favored a more cautious and cooperative stance towards the Soviet Union. Patton's combative nature and his belief that the Soviet threat should be neutralized immediately clashed with the careful diplomacy of the time. While Patton's warnings may have been prescient, his methods were not in line with the more cautious foreign policy being pursued by the US government. His blunt statements alienated him from political leaders who were working to stabilize Europe and prevent the Cold War from escalating. Instead of being seen as a voice of reason, Patton was increasingly viewed as a dangerous, unpredictable figure who threatened the delicate post-war peace. Patton's post-war leadership crisis, from hero to pariah. Patton's unrelenting criticism of Soviet policy was not the only issue that caused tension in the post-war military environment. His behavior, his explosive personality, and his disregard for political norms all contributed to his rapid decline. Despite his incredible success on the battlefield, Patton's inability to adapt to the realities of peace and diplomacy led to a crisis of leadership. In 1945, just months after the defeat of Nazi Germany, Patton was removed from command. His outspoken views on the Soviets, combined with his abrasive behavior, made him a liability in the new political climate. General Eisenhower, who had once worked closely with Patton and had great respect for his military talents, was now distancing himself from the fiery general. The public spectacle of Patton's comments, coupled with his earlier controversies, made him a politically dangerous figure. Patton was assigned to less important roles, including the governorship of the U.S. occupation zone in Bavaria, Germany. It was a far cry from the command he had held during the war, and Patton himself found the role frustrating. He saw it as a demotion, a punishment for his unwillingness to toe the line. His frustration only deepened as he realized that, despite his battlefield successes, he was now sidelined in a world that valued diplomacy and political maneuvering more than battlefield triumphs. Patton's behavior in post-war Germany didn't help his situation. His disdain for the denazification policies and his efforts to re-establish former German officials in positions of power were seen as deeply controversial. He believed that Germany should be rehabilitated quickly, and that the focus should be on rebuilding the country rather than punishing it. But his willingness to speak openly about these views alienated him from the powers that were shaping post-war Europe. In Patton's eyes, the war was over, but his fight was just beginning. He couldn't understand why the US military, having won the war so decisively, would now retreat into diplomacy and compromise. His frustration grew as he watched the shift in power away from the military to the politicians. His belief in strength, speed, and decisiveness was being replaced by a more cautious approach, one that emphasized negotiation and international cooperation over confrontation. This was a battle Patton couldn't win, and it set the stage for his professional downfall. Patton's declining influence, a man on the sidelines. The tension between Patton's military brilliance and his political isolation reached a breaking point in 1945. He was increasingly sidelined by the American military leadership, and his once prominent place in the US Army had been drastically diminished. The very traits that had made him a celebrated figure during World War II, his unrelenting drive, his willingness to take risks, his passion for combat, had become liabilities in the post-war world. Patton's post-war role had been relegated to a mere shadow of his former self. He was no longer at the forefront of military strategy or diplomacy. Instead, he was caught in a bureaucratic battle he couldn't win. His belief that military leaders should control the direction of foreign policy clashed with the increasing influence of diplomats and politicians who were steering the course of international relations. The generals who once fought alongside him were now content to follow the political agenda set by the White House. For Patton, this was a betrayal of everything he had fought for. In late 1945, Patton's command was further reduced. He was given the role of overseeing the management of German civilians in Bavaria, a position that limited his authority and influence. To Patton, it was an insult. He was a man who had once led armies, commanded massive operations, and freed nations. Now, he was tasked with managing day-to-day operations in a defeated country. His influence on the military was diminished, and his voice was increasingly ignored. Patton's frustration with his new role was evident. The sharp, decisive leader who had pushed his soldiers to victory now found himself sidelined by a bureaucracy that valued diplomacy over strength. Patton's own words, "I'm being retired to a desk," echoed in his private conversations, signaling his growing dissatisfaction with his reduced role. His sense of betrayal was palpable. He had given his all for the war effort, and now, in his mind, he was being discarded. His decline was not just professional, it was personal. Patton, a man whose identity was intertwined with his military success, was grappling with the reality of a world that no longer valued the boldness and aggression that had defined his leadership style. His interactions with political figures, Eisenhower's contradictory relationship. One of the most striking features of Patton's post-war experience was his complicated relationship with General Dwight D. Eisenhower. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower had worked closely with Patton during the war. He understood Patton's strengths and weaknesses, but Eisenhower also recognized that Patton's fiery nature made him unpredictable and sometimes dangerous in the political realm. While Eisenhower admired Patton's tactical genius and boldness, he also saw how Patton's unrelenting personality could alienate those around him. After the war, Eisenhower became President of the United States, and his political savvy shaped his decisions regarding Patton. Eisenhower understood the need to balance military might with diplomacy, something that Patton could not grasp. Eisenhower's more diplomatic, calculated approach to foreign relations was in stark contrast to Patton's blunt, aggressive style. Eisenhower, though sympathetic to Patton's genius, made it clear that Patton's disregard for diplomatic norms could not be tolerated. The two men, once allies in battle, had become political opposites. In private, Patton's growing frustration with Eisenhower's policies was evident. He had no patience for the compromises Eisenhower made with the Soviet Union and was open in his criticism of the political leadership. To Patton, Eisenhower's more cautious approach was a betrayal of the principles that had won the war. However, Eisenhower, having made the leap from military leader to politician, understood that the world had changed. Eisenhower was not willing to let Patton's outbursts derail the delicate post-war peace, and he distanced himself from Patton's increasingly erratic behavior. The tension between Patton and Eisenhower reflected the broader struggle within the US military, the transition from wartime to peacetime, and the new political realities that governed international relations. Patton's inability to navigate these changes and his unwillingness to temper his approach left him isolated. The mysterious death, the car accident, and lingering theories. On December 21st, 1945, George S. Patton's life came to a sudden and tragic end. The general, who had been a central figure in the Allied victory during World War II, was involved in a car accident that left him severely injured. Patton's car, driven by his chauffeur, crashed into a telephone pole near Mannheim, Germany, causing the general to suffer severe neck and spinal injuries. He was rushed to the hospital, but despite his immense will to survive, Patton succumbed to his injuries on December 21st, just 12 days later. He was 60 years old. While his death was officially ruled as the result of a car accident, the circumstances surrounding Patton's death have remained shrouded in mystery. Over the years, various theories have emerged, casting doubt on the official story. Some suggest that the accident was no mere mishap, that it was an act of foul play. The theories range from the plausible to the outlandish. Some believe that Patton was deliberately targeted for his outspoken views on the Soviets and his growing opposition to post-war US foreign policy. Others speculate that his death was a political maneuver, meant to silence a man who had become too volatile for the New World Order. At the time of his death, Patton was in the process of being reassigned to a new role, one that would take him away from Germany and back to the United States. He was not happy with his demotion and felt that his military career had been unfairly cut short. His frustration with the political landscape had been palpable, and many close to him had reported that Patton feared for his future. It is within this context of discontent and political upheaval that some historians and military experts speculate that there may have been more to the car accident than meets the eye. However, despite the many theories, no definitive evidence has ever been found to suggest foul play. The mystery of Patton's death, much like his career, only deepened his mythos. It added another layer to the complex figure of a man who had been both admired and reviled, a general who commanded great respect yet left behind a trail of controversy. Patton's death, sudden and unexpected, left many unanswered questions, and it forever marked the end of an era for both the US Army and the world. In the aftermath, his legacy was left to be debated, not just by his contemporaries, but by generations to come. Legacy in history, the unshakable mark of a soldier. Despite the controversies that swirled around him during his life and after his death, George S. Patton's impact on modern warfare is undeniable. His contributions to the evolution of military strategy, particularly in the use of tanks, remain influential in military doctrine to this day. Patton was a pioneer in the use of mechanized warfare, pushing for tanks to be integrated into the core of military operations, rather than used as support units. His aggressive tactics, his belief in speed and mobility, and his unrelenting pursuit of victory changed the way wars were fought. Patton's leadership in World War II, particularly during the invasion of Sicily, the Battle of the Bulge, and the rapid advance through France, demonstrated the effectiveness of his strategies. His ability to inspire troops, his fearlessness in battle, and his knack for making bold decisions in the heat of combat made him one of the most celebrated commanders of the war. Patton's vision of warfare was shaped by his experience in World War I, where he recognized that the future of combat lay in the ability to move swiftly and decisively. In this, Patton was a visionary, a man ahead of his time. However, Patton's contributions to warfare went beyond tactics. He was also instrumental in shaping military leadership in the 20th century. His emphasis on discipline, his belief in the importance of personal responsibility, and his ability to lead from the front set a new standard for military commanders. While his methods were unorthodox, his leadership style had a lasting impact on the generations of soldiers who served under him. Many of Patton's former officers would go on to command in the Korean War and Vietnam War, carrying with them lessons they had learned from their time under Patton's command. His legacy also extends beyond military strategy. Patton's larger-than-life persona, his fierce determination, and his willingness to take risks in battle made him a symbol of American strength during one of the darkest times in world history. To this day, Patton's name is synonymous with courage, decisiveness, and a commitment to victory at any cost. Yet, while his military accomplishments are often praised, they exist in contrast to the darker aspects of his personality. The arrogance, the violent temper, and the inability to temper his views. The complexities of Patton's character ensure that his legacy is not one-dimensional. He was a man who inspired both admiration and fear, and this duality has left a lasting imprint on how history remembers him. Enduring controversy, the hero, the tyrant, and the price of war. As time has passed, the debate over Patton's legacy has only grown more complex. To some, Patton is seen as one of the greatest military leaders the world has ever known. His brilliance on the battlefield and his unyielding commitment to victory make him a hero in the eyes of many. For others, however, Patton is a figure whose flaws outweighed his talents, a man whose impulsiveness, volatility, and lack of political savvy led to unnecessary controversies. The slapping incident, his abrasive personality, and his insubordination to his superiors all contribute to a portrait of a man who was both brilliant and deeply flawed. Historians and military experts continue to debate whether Patton's aggressive tactics were truly groundbreaking, or if they were simply reckless. Some argue that his insistence on speed and offensive action was the key to the Allies' success in Europe, while others believe that his methods resulted in unnecessary casualties and prolonged battles. The criticism of Patton's behavior towards soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, as well as his open antagonism towards Soviet forces, continues to divide opinions about his legacy. His outspoken views on political matters often overshadowed his military genius, creating a complex and contradictory image of the general. Was Patton a visionary who saw the world as it would soon become? Or was he simply an arrogant man whose inability to adapt to a post-war world led to his downfall? Patton's enduring legacy lies in the influence he continues to have on military leaders today. Many of his tactics, speed, aggression, and the integration of new technology like tanks remain central to modern military strategy. His leadership style, marked by personal responsibility, a commitment to action, and the ability to inspire men to follow him into battle, has influenced countless commanders. At the same time, Patton's darker traits, his temper, his inability to compromise, and his disregard for political realities, serve as cautionary lessons for those in power. His legacy is a reminder that the traits that make a great soldier do not always make for a great leader in the political and diplomatic spheres. Historians and military experts weigh in on Patton's legacy. To this day, military historians and scholars continue to debate Patton's legacy. Some view him as a military genius whose innovative tactics and leadership were crucial in securing Allied victory in World War II. Others see him as a flawed hero, a man whose greatest strength, his unwavering belief in his own abilities, was also his greatest weakness. The complexity of Patton's character ensures that his legacy is constantly being re-examined. As historian Carlo d'Este, a biographer of Patton, once noted, Patton was a man whose brilliance was often overshadowed by his ego and personality. For many, Patton's genius as a tactician is undeniable. His ability to think outside the box, to make quick decisions under pressure, and to push his men to accomplish seemingly impossible tasks is what made him one of the most effective commanders of his era. But this genius came at a price. Patton's unrelenting drive for victory led to high casualties, and his inability to recognize the importance of diplomacy and politics created an image of a man who was both a hero and a tyrant. In the end, Patton's legacy is not one that can be easily defined. He was both a great military leader and a man whose actions often left a trail of controversy. For many military leaders today, Patton's influence is still felt. His teachings on leadership, his emphasis on speed, mobility, and aggression, and his belief in the power of the individual soldier have shaped the way modern militaries operate. Yet, for all of his success, Patton's inability to navigate the political realities of post-war Europe and his controversial actions both on and off the battlefield remain part of his story. His legacy is not simply that of a hero, but of a man who challenged the very nature of leadership and who, in doing so, left behind a legacy of both brilliance and cautionary tales.